Hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Classic Gaming Brothers. I'm Seth.
And I'm Zach.
And we are the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right. We are the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right.
Happy belated Valentine's Day.
Yes, I was going to say that. Happy Valentine's Day. And, you know, if we thought about this better, we could have done a Valentine's Day video game episode.
There's always next year.
There is always next year. And I feel like we try to shoehorn holiday episodes into every holiday. And eventually we're going to do like Earth Day related episodes and people are going to get frustrated with us.
Man, this could have been a sequel to the President's Day episode.
Could have been. I don't know if there's any more wood to chop there.
JFK Reloaded.
Didn't we talk about JFK Reloaded?
Yeah, I think we did.
We definitely talked about JFK is back.
The best game. No President's Day episode. No, that's not us. We're covering a different topic today. We're covering a topic unrelated to presidents. But before we do, Seth, what have you been recently playing?
Recently, I've been playing Dead Cells. It's a roguelike Metroidvania-inspired action platformer that was released back in 2018 and developed and published by Motion Twin. I've been playing it on my Steam Deck. It's one of those I generally play my roguelites, so like Hollow Knight, Dead Cells, Hades. Like I play all those games strictly on the Steam Deck. I like playing them on the Steam Deck. They're good games to kind of jump into when you have some downtime, but you don't really want to get invested into anything for any period of time. So Dead Cells is one of those type of games. I really liking Dead Cells. It also gets me sometimes frustrated because I had a very good run where I collected all the things and I was like comboing off of everybody and I was going super fast and I just was like living the high life. And I died. And that restarted me from the very beginning. And I was really sad because there was a moment where I didn't think I was going to die. And then I did.
That's sad.
It was just really sad, and I was upset. So sometimes I put games like Dead Cells and Hades and Hollow Knight back down after moments like that. However, it's fun. It's different. It's also got. I like how these like roguelike games are similar-ish, but different enough that, you know, there's a different kind of experience. But yeah, definitely like it's all about going through various different, it's like a 2D type of Souls game where you're going through killing, dying, learning, repeating, dying and dying and dying. For me, it's just dying, killing, dying. I don't learn, so it's just dying. But yeah, it's fun. I like it. It's a cool game. It's got a cool aesthetic and all that jazz. But yeah, so Dead Cells, probably one of the games that, I don't know, I think it's still pretty popular.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I'm known people to still play it. So beyond you, right. I think it is probably definitely still popular.
Zach.
Yes, Seth.
What have you recently been playing?
Seth, recently I've been playing Mystery House, developed in 1980 by Ken and Roberta Williams. It was one of their first games that they put out for the Apple II, and I've in fact been playing it on my Apple II using a floppy that I copied. You know what they say, don't copy that floppy? Well, I said I don't want to spend $100 on a floppy disk because Mystery House is rather expensive to try to find an original copy of. Mystery House is definitely a game I could probably just easily emulate, but I thought it would just be fun to try it out on real hardware. It's a just fun little graphical adventure game where you solve a mystery in a house. Like it's a mystery set in a Victorian mansion. You know, it is very much an early adventure game. It does have some graphics to it, but it does kind of feel like a blend of both text adventures and what graphic adventures would evolve into in the 1990s, largely thanks to Sierra. But yeah, I've been enjoying it. I'm going to try to play a bit more of it when I can, and I might try to tackle some of the other early Sierra games. Thankfully, a lot of them only fit onto one disc, so it makes easy to like copy and play one. There is like, I think their Dark Crystal game is like a 4-disc thing, so that's always fun when you have multiple discs that you need to copy. Let me tell you, when I copy discs onto the Apple II, I don't think I've really talked about this. The process is thankfully rather simple with a little bit of cost. So it obviously costs money to buy blank floppy disks. I've lucked out and I've gotten new old stock a couple of times, so sealed cases of 5 1/4 floppy disks that are in great condition. However, I don't have a million of those, so I do try to use them sparingly. I do aim for double-sided disks, so I can obviously use both sides if I need to. However, every disc I've ever bought only has non-write protection on one side, so I can't use the other side.
Is there like a switch?
No. because on the old 5 1/4s, there's just a chunk missing. So I actually have to physically cut out, using scissors and an X-Acto blade, the other notch so I can copy the other side. Otherwise, it won't copy. So it is a process, and it's obnoxious. But beyond that, it's otherwise fairly easy. I use a tool called ADT Pro, which allows you to plug a USB cord into your computer or laptop, and then a serial cord into the back of your Apple II. And you literally, as long as you have a super serial card, which I do, and all you have to do is just load in the proper software, and you can transfer disk data over serial using a USB cable into the disk, so you can write disks, and it makes it an easy process to make disks for your Apple II. However, like I said, there is still cost associated with it, as I do need to acquire new old stock. That's just a fun other thing to do. Anyway, today we're going to be talking about Chrono Trigger. Chrono Trigger is an RPG that I'm definitely familiar with because I've played it a bit before on the Super Nintendo. I've also played a bit of the PlayStation 1 version because I have a copy of Final Fantasy Chronicles, which it is on. Seth, do you have any specific memories or thoughts about Chrono Trigger before we get into the history?
I have more recent memories of Chrono Trigger as I was playing it more recent. Like, my first time playing it was probably within 10 years ago, which I would say is more recent of a time than like my early childhood. I probably played it on some sort of SNES emulation, and I enjoy it. It's a fun little game that involves some time traveling, which is always fun. I like time traveling. And I believe there's a frog in it that is like a knight, and
yeah, his name's Frog.
Yeah, and I've played definitely the intro to Chrono Trigger more often than you would have to admit. I'm also somebody when it comes to games like Final Fantasy or Chrono Trigger, I generally use a guide to play through it because I don't like missing things.
That's very fair.
And I recently was playing it on the cruise that I took, and so I had to download an entire website because we had no internet. So when we had internet for a period of time, I downloaded an entire website through an offline website like imager that like pulled off every single page and script in the website so I could use the website without internet for a walkthrough of Chrono Trigger. So I still have saved on my phone a offline version of the entire walkthrough of Chrono Trigger that I can use and if I need to. If I was on a desert island with only my cell phone and a
copy of Chrono
Trigger, I could use a guide to beat it.
Man, I love that for you.
Even without internet, it would still be pretty lazy. Do you have any memories you want to talk about?
No, I mean, I mostly, like, I've played it before on the Super Nintendo through, like, emulation. I've played it on the PS1. It's a good game. I haven't beaten it. I'm just bad with beating RPGs in general. So it's one of those games that I definitely want to tackle at some point. And, I mentioned at the beginning of the year that I wanted to try to play some of the older Final Fantasy games. So Chrono Trigger is definitely a game I would want to try to play. But yeah, beyond that, I don't really have any specific memories. Though I do sometimes confuse Chrono Trigger for Secret of Mana. I think it's just because they are two expensive Super Nintendo games that I like playing.
I think I also get them confused. I just know Chrono Trigger has the time travel.
Yes.
And also the combat's different.
Yes. Chrono Trigger is more of a traditional turn-based RPG, while Secret of Mana is an action RPG.
I call it a whack and hackin'.
Whack and hackin'?
Yeah.
A wacky hacky.
No, wacky hacky. So Chrono Trigger is truly the game that came about when someone asked, what would happen if we combined Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and Akira Toriyama in a single video game? The game was developed by the Dream Team, as coined by Square, creator of Final Fantasy Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of Dragon Quest Yuji Horii, and famed manga artist and character designer Akira Toriyama. These three are pretty great at what they do.
Yeah, I mean, Toriyama is Dragon Ball and Dragon Ball Z. Like, yeah, he's huge.
The Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy were also gigantic franchises, especially in Japan, for sure. So they sat together, the three of them, and they wanted to create a game that was new to the world of RPGs and something that hoped that no one had done before. They would go on to work with Kazuhiko Aoki, who served as producer for the game, coming up with different scenarios over the course of about 4 days. Square would bring on a team of around 60 to work on the project. I just like this for them. So they get three of who they feel are some of their top people, right? They get them in a room with the producer and they give them 4 days. And then when they're like, we think we got something, they hire 60 people or like allocate 60 people to this project. They're like, we're good. Or maybe the 4 days was that's all they needed. Like they were in there for 4 days.
They locked in.
Yeah, I just picture like chain smoking cigarettes because I think of the other guy from Nintendo.
Oh, Miyamoto.
Miyamoto, yeah.
Yeah.
So Square brings these 60 people in to work on the project, and development would kick off in 1993. The idea of time travel, per the Chrono Trigger fandom page, was part of the initial outlines from Yuji Horii, himself being a fan of the time travel genre. You and me both, buddy. The outline for the game would be done by Masato Kato, who built out the majority of the game. Kato would also be the one who incorporated the idea of multiple endings into the game. Art design would be handled by Toriyama, hence why you may recognize the style of art if you ever looked at the pictures of the characters. Toriyama's involvement also meant that the developers felt more free to include humor in the game to match Toriyama's style of manga.
I was reading that was kind of a plus for them because they wouldn't really be able to do that with Final Fantasy because Final Fantasy had such a kind of set guidelines at this point. So
right.
they really they had a bit more freedom with Chrono Trigger. Now, one plan for the game was for it to actually be part of the Mana franchise, which works out because I often confuse it for Secret of Mana. And the game briefly had the working title of Maru Island. At some point, the game was rebranded to the name Chrono Trigger, which itself was actually a code name used for Secret of Mana. So there was always kind of a little bit of Mana element into this whole mix. Hence maybe why I'm confused. Maybe I subconsciously knew that Secret of Mana at one point was called Chrono Trigger. The development did also coincide with the development of Final Fantasy VI. So when that game had released, the team would be added onto the Chrono Trigger project. One unique feature in Chrono Trigger would be that there was something called active time event logic. This is something that's probably kind of old hat to like most RPGs nowadays, but it just means that you can move your character during scenes, including talking to an NPC, which allows you to steer the story in a way that you want, bouncing the conversation off from one NPC to the next, and allowing for more variations to how the story is structured, depending on who was playing. Really unique idea for the time. The team did struggle with keeping the game at a reasonable size. One problem in particular was that the monster sprites took up more memory than Final Fantasy games due to the fact that they were now animated. This ultimately meant that the game would have to be released on a larger cartridge, specifically a 32 megabit cartridge with battery-backed RAM. As a comparison, Final Fantasy IV was 24 megabit. Super Mario World was 4 megabits. So 32 megabits is a big deal because that also means it's more expensive to produce the cartridge. Now, a feature in the game that they added thanks to early playtesting allowed for players to replay the game with all your levels and your gear. Now, this is something that is available in plenty of games nowadays. However, it was relatively new, and they came up with a term to describe this ability to replay the game with all your levels and all your gear. They called it New Game Plus, which is where the term was coined. So before Chrono Trigger, there were games that allowed you to do this, right? Like Super Mario Brothers, you can replay the game at the very end. You play like the harder version of the game, which is effectively New Game Plus. Chrono Trigger was the first to call it New Game Plus, and that is the name that has stuck. And pretty much any game that's released nowadays has a New Game Plus feature, or people want a New Game Plus feature, and it's thanks to Chrono Trigger we even have the phrase.
Music in the game was scored by Yasunori Masuda. Masuda got the job because he complained about his pay, and Hironobu Sakaguchi reportedly told him to work on Chrono Trigger and maybe his salary would go up. Which, I mean, sometimes that's how you get new jobs.
He apparently was threatening to quit, too. He was like, if you don't pay me more, I'll quit.
He was assisted by Nobu Uematsu and Noriko Matsuda, who provided some contribution to the score. The work on the game was a stressful time for Matsuda. He not only lost about 40 tracks of music due to a hard drive failure, but also developed stomach ulcers throughout it. Uematsu would finish the score while Mitsuda would end up being hospitalized and down for the count. Chrono Trigger would go on to be localized by Ted Woolsey, who was tasked with localizing the game in 30 days. Ted Woolsey also localized a bunch of stuff. I'm pretty sure there's like Final Fantasy 6. There's like the Ted Woolsey localization that you can get as because there's like a Ted Woolsey localization and then like a English translation type of deal. So the Ted Woolsey would be tasked with localizing Chrono Trigger. Woolsey didn't have a translation team, so he had to memorize sequences in the game and review player guide drafts to help him with the dialogue. Some localized changes for the North American release included the removal of references to alcohol, breastfeeding, and religion, which are the three things that usually are removed from Japanese games when they come to America. Chrono Trigger was scheduled to be released in Japan in 1994, but was delayed. Alpha versions were demoed at the V-Jump Festival in Japan in both 94 and 95, and a beta version would be sent to magazines for review. The game would finally release in March of 1995 in Japan and August of 1995 in America. I also think about this sometimes when we see games delayed, because there are games that are delayed nowadays for years, right? There's games that have been being delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed. And I feel like when they were developing games for like the SNES, they knew like there was a timeline, right? Ultimately, like they had to get it done. Not only because the company was pushing on them, but like there was a cycle life for these. There still is vaguely a cycle life for consoles.
Yeah.
But like they knew the NES was ended. They were going to make an SNES. There may be something coming out. Technology, ever progressing to the singularity. So like they knew that was going to happen. So I feel like there's always this kind of like balance that they were in. And I'm sure they were excited to finally release the game in 95 in Japan and then localized over to America in August of that year. So March for Japan and August for America. A few years after its release in 1999, the company Tosi would develop a port of Chrono Trigger for the PS1 and release as part of a collection called Final Fantasy Chronicles. And that collection also contained Final Fantasy IV.
Yeah.
The port contains animated cutscenes that were animated by Toei Animation Company. So what's in this Final Fantasy Chronicles?
It's Final Fantasy IV and Chrono Trigger. That's it.
That's a weird...
It's a very weird combination, yeah.
But it's also just a weird name for the Chronic. Like I would assume that it would be like every Final Fantasy.
They did have another release out called Final Fantasy Origins, which featured 1 through 3, and that was also for the PS1.
And then Chronicles was just 4 and
Chrono Trigger.
Chrono Trigger?
Yeah.
4, 5, and 6?
Final Fantasy Anthology had 5 and 6.
Oh, I guess that makes sense.
Now, the gameplay for Chrono Trigger it's an RPG, your standard JRPG, turn-based elements. It does have a fairly complex story. To mostly sum it up, it takes place on an Earth-like planet, and time travel is involved. The game has 6 playable characters who are all from different time periods. The starting characters are Chrono, Marle, and Luca, who are from 1000 AD. You meet Robo, who is from 2300 AD, and Robo is a robot, and his theme song is very similar to Never Gonna Give You Up by Rick Astley. I will play a little of his theme song here. And a little bit of a Rickroll here. So you can compare them, but they are very similar, and I think it's very funny. There's also the character of Ayla, who is from 65 million BC. There is Frog, who is in fact a frog from 600 AD. And there's an optional 7th character of Magus, who is from, I think, 12,000 BC, though he's also connected to Frog. Anyway, the story begins in 1000 AD in the Kingdom of Guardia when Chrono, Marl, and Luca watch Luca's father show off a teleporter that he invented for the Millennial Fair. After the performance, Luca and Chrono try to recreate the portal, and it sends them to 600 AD. They end up finding Marl there, who gets consumed by a time paradox due to the fact that she looks very similar to the missing Queen Lean from this time period. Queen Lean is in fact Marl's ancestor. The people of 600 AD mistake Marl for Queen Lean, who is missing, so they stop looking for her because they find Marl and they're like, the queen. We don't have to look for the queen anymore. So because the queen has never been found, Marl is never born, so she gets eaten by a time paradox because she wouldn't have been born and then, she wouldn't have gone back in time. It gets confusing. Anyway, you're then tasked with finding the queen so you can restore the proper timeline, though additional shenanigans are involved, as you can imagine, because one part of the game does in fact take place in 65 million BC, and you eventually do have to fight off a parasitic creature known as Lavos, who fell to the planet back in 65 million BC. Again, Chrono Trigger is a very complex game. It's an RPG. It has multiple endings, multiple levels to it, and I didn't really feel like going too deep into the story, because I think if you want to play Chrono Trigger, you should just play Chrono Trigger, and you don't need to listen to us describe the plot in detail. Ultimately, I think you should check out Chrono Trigger. It's just a great game, and yeah, you should experience it for yourself. Seth, how did Chrono Trigger do, though?
Chrono Trigger was a bestseller in Japan. In 2 months, it sold 2 million copies and ended the year as the second best-selling game of 1995, second to Dragon Quest VI. When it was released in the US, it would also see some success, but not nearly the same level as Japan, as it would only sell around 289,000 copies, which is shy of 2 million. By 2006, the SNES version had sold in total around 2.5 million copies worldwide. The game also knocked it out of the park in reviews. The publication All Game gave it 5 stars, Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it a 37 out of 40, GamePro gave it a 20 out of 20, and Next Generation rated it 4 out of 5 stars. Electronic Gaming Monthly would also later award the game with the Best Super NES Game Award, Best Role-Playing Game Award, Best Music in a Cartridge-Based Game Award. The publication Famitsu would also rate the game as number 28 in their list of all-time top 100 in the year 2006.
Chrono Trigger would also get some related media thanks to a Satellaview service in Japan. I think we briefly covered the Satellaview many moons ago, but the Satellaview was in fact a satellite service that allowed you to download games and other content to your Super Nintendo in Japan. Chrono Trigger would have a couple of Satellaview exclusives. Chrono Trigger Jet Bike Special was a racing game based on a mini game that happens in Chrono Trigger. There's also Chrono Trigger Music Library, which was in fact a library of music. And there was Chrono Trigger Character Library, which is in fact a library of character profiles. And there were some sequels as well. There was actually a sequel put out on the Satellaview called Radical Dreamers, which was a text-based adventure game that is set in a side story to the main game. Radical Dreamers would be written and directed by Masato Kato. Chrono Trigger would get one sequel that would come out in the United States and also Japan, being Chrono Cross, which released in 1999 for the PS1. It functions as both a sequel to the main game, but also incorporates new elements to the world, such as parallel universes. And that would be it. Really. There aren't any other Chrono Trigger games that are really out. There are some related games, but they're not really in the same universe. But as of 2025, there are no plans yet to bring a new Chrono Trigger game to the scene. A fun fact, though, that Seth might be interested in knowing is that Fergus Urquhart of Obsidian did once casually mention that he would really like to make a Chrono Trigger game sometime.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, apparently he's being interviewed in 2010. Someone asked him, what game would you like to make if you could pick any game? And he said Chrono Trigger. Who knows, maybe Fergus will make Chrono Trigger for Obsidian. Now, the game would eventually be ported to the Nintendo DS. That was released in 2008. There's also an iOS port in 2011, an Android port also in 2011, and a Windows port in 2018 that you can get on Steam. There was a 16-minute OVA produced by Production IG in 1996 for V-Jump called Dimensional Adventure Numa Major. And there was also a manga series that ran very shortly in V-Jump that followed Chrono Trigger as well. Outside of official content, the game would be backported to the Famicom by Shenzhen Nanjing Technology as a pirated release. This port, called Shikong Shi Lu, features a typo in the title sequence of the game, and it doesn't call it Chrono Trigger, and in fact calls it Kananro Trigger because it replaces the H with an N. The game also features recycled assets from previous releases from Shenzhen Nanjing, such as Pokemon assets that they used for their release of Pokemon Yellow, meaning you occasionally fight Pokemon characters as Chrono, which is great, but that will do it for Chrono Trigger. I think Chrono Trigger is a great game. If, again, like I mentioned earlier when talking about the plot, if you haven't played it and you like JRPGs, you should play it. There's really no excuse not to if you are a fan of that genre. If you're not a fan of that genre, maybe just give it a try and see if it makes you a fan, but if you're truly not a fan, you don't have to play it.
Do you know who really loves Chrono Trigger? SNES Drunk. So if you want to watch some videos about Chrono Trigger, SNES Drunk has a bunch of them because he really likes Chrono Trigger.
Yeah, I don't blame him. Getting into our retro rewind, Seth had me play Landstalker for the Sega Genesis, an isometric RPG developed by Climax Entertainment. You play as a treasure hunter named Nigel, and you in fact go on an adventure. The game is pretty fun. I liked the gameplay once I got used to it. The controls were a little wonky to begin with, largely because the isometric view was just a bit disorienting. So sometimes the controls I was using didn't quite work the way I expected, but once you get used to it, I think it's fine. I did find some of the sequences in the beginning of the game, like the opening itself, to be rather long. Like the intro itself just took a real long time before you actually got into any action, and there was no way to skip it. It was taking I had to take upward to 4 or 5 minutes of just watching your character move through the cave when you could just be playing it yourself. And I was like, man, I wish I was playing this and not just watching my character do all this for me. And 4 or 5 minutes doesn't sound very long. It's long when you're just watching this character and you can't skip anything. Overall, though, I do think Landstalker does hold up. I think it's a fun action RPG game. I recommend checking it out if you're a fan of that genre. Next week, Seth, you can play Ogre Battle: The March of the Black Queen for the Super Nintendo.
Thank you. Zach had me play Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 4, developed by Kemco and released on the Game Boy Color in the year 2000. This is not Kemco's first Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle, and it will not be their last. There is, in fact, a whole series of Crazy Castle games that involve the Warner Brothers cartoon characters. There are, in Bugs Bunny Crazy Castle 4, 100 levels across 13 different stages, and Bugs Bunny has to navigate all these locations by walking around, opening doors, and getting keys. You get enough keys, you open the last door, and you move on to the next stage. Each one of these doors has a little chest inside, and inside these chests are usually keys, but sometimes there's weapons, and you can fight enemies with them, or you can actually interact with things in the level to fight things like Pepe Le Pew. I had no idea how to jump. I don't think you can jump, except by bouncing on these mushrooms that are sometimes scattered throughout the level. I think the game plays okay. I do think that it is relatively underwhelming compared to its contemporaries in 2000, and it was also towards the end of life of the GBC, or at least the Game Boy Advance was being released the following year in 2001. And I just don't, if I took games from 2000 on the Game Boy Color and games that were, coming out on the GBA in 2001, I just don't think it holds up against them during that time. I think for what it was, which maybe if you had a car ride and you needed some distraction, I think it could fill that void. But for somebody who's listening to this podcast in 2025, I don't necessarily think you need to go back and play it. It's interesting, but it's also nothing too exciting. Opening the doors and going through all this, getting all the keys is kind of annoying. I didn't hate myself though after playing it, so that's new.
Oh, that's good. I'm glad to hear that you don't hate yourself.
Yes. Anyway, next week, Zach, you can play Wacky Wheels for MS-DOS.
I will. That being said, thank you everyone for listening to this episode. If you have any memories of Chrono Trigger, let us know. You can do so by emailing us at classicgamingbrothers@gmail.com. We're available wherever podcasts can be found, be it iTunes, Podbean, or iHeartRadio. We're available on social media. Just look us up, Classic Gaming Brothers or CGB Brothers Pod. And of course, you can find us at www.classicgamingbrothers.com. That being said, Seth, am I forgetting anything?
Don't play games like my brother.
And don't play games like my brother.
I've been Seth.
And I've been Zach.
And we've been the Classic Gaming Brothers.
That's right.
That's right.